On January 3rd, 1956, a normally placid neighborhood experienced a disturbance that changed the course of its history. At 13601 Corby Road, an unoccupied garage exploded while under construction. The motives were unclear, but the incident was no mere accident. John and Dorothy Pegg, an affluent Black couple, had received threats of intimidation before moving into their new home and even had their windows shattered. The bombing was the most visceral sign of neighborhood resentment, but not every resident was so antagonistic. Out of the bombing emerged a small interracial group of married couples determined to maintain neighborhood tranquility and, amidst the burgeoning civil rights movement, strive to maintain racial integration. But before we delve into that, let's provide some important background information. Ludlow is a neighborhood that lies geographically in both Cleveland and Shaker Heights. Designed by the Van Sweringen brothers in the early 20th century, the two sought to have Shaker Heights appeal to, quote, upper-class citizens. This picturesque community appealed to affluent residents seeking to escape increasing pollution and overcrowding in Cleveland. But this ideal community was exclusionary. By 1920, the Van Sweringen Company imposed restrictive covenants that excluded Jews of, quote, a lesser means, Catholics, and Blacks. Former Ludlow resident Shelley Stokes Hammond outlined in her master's thesis, Recognizing Ludlow, that white residents enforced these restrictions. Despite Black professionals' economic standing and desire to escape segregated ghettos, white residents in East Side suburbs responded with threats and violence throughout the 1920s. These violent responses hardened racial exclusion and led many Black families to remain in ghettos rather than risk their personal and financial security by becoming pioneers. In the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer decision, the Supreme Court ruled restrictive covenants violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Subsequently, the ruling allowed Black families to move into previously restrictive areas. Middle-class Black families began purchasing homes in the Ludlow community in the 1950s, but due to customary residential segregation practices, many households needed their neighbors to approve the purchases. As more Blacks moved in, real estate agents increased block busting, which refers to the practice of an agent moving in non-whites, usually a Black family, into an all-white neighborhood to exploit white fears of demographic change and property devaluation. White residents in Ludlow were not immune from widespread racial fears of integration. Despite the economic standing of Black newcomers, these residents believed the neighborhood was turning into a ghetto. But the bombing of the Peggs' home was a turning point. Out of the flames emerged the Ludlow Community Association, LCA for short, which formed in 1957 and became incorporated in 1959. The LCA served as a national example to promote neighborhood integration and address concerns about panic selling. Members began to implement strategies to stem blockbusting and encourage white residents to remain and purchase homes in the community. This was no small feat. The practice of blockbusting continued as real estate agents refused to show white home buyers the neighborhood, and banks made it difficult for them to secure a mortgage. In 1960, the LCA received a $7,500 grant from the Cleveland Foundation to establish a real estate clearinghouse and hire a housing director. The newly established Ludlow Company, a mortgage enterprise, provided finance to down payments to the purchase of homes by whites in the Ludlow neighborhood. The company sought white home buyers through personal contacts, newspaper advertisements, brochure distribution, posters placed in key institutions and industries, and hosted house hunting parties. From 1960 to 1963, the company sold 35 houses to white families. Additionally, the LCA held several successful fundraisers to operate the housing program. In 1966, the organization raised $10,000 when it hosted Ella Fitzgerald, and a year later, it raised $15,000 for the performances of Nancy Wilson and The Fifth Dimension. Controversially, emphasizing attracting white home buyers meant discouraging Black people from purchasing homes. There was no explicit restriction against Black home buyers, but few, if any, Blacks purchased properties through the company. This custom, of course, didn't go well with everyone, but the controversial tactic worked. From 1964 to 1967, the company reversed the annual rate of change in the neighborhood. Given these intentional efforts, Ludlow transitioned racially from majority Black to white by the late 1960s. After the Ludlow Company ceased operations during the 1970s, the city of Shaker Heights launched its pro-integrative housing program. Over the next decade, the neighborhood demographics shifted to 55% minority. Today, the neighborhood is around 85% Black. The LCA remains active, but its focus on integration waned by the late 1990s and early 2000s. To contemporary audiences, the Ludlow Community Association might appear as a historical oxymoron. Adopting racial quotas to keep the neighborhood integrated stood contrary to real estate practices. But without these efforts, the neighborhood would have become predominantly Black by 1965 with no turning back. Instead, residents sought racial balance and recanted various contemporary stereotypes about integration by avoiding racial friction and maintaining quality schools. Many residents then and now have cherished memories of living in such a unique community. For these reasons, their efforts deserve acknowledgement.